This is the Comics Alternative, episode 273, reviews of Bizarre Romance, The Ballad of Sang, number 1, and Gideon Falls, number 1. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Gene, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics again.
That's right. And on this week's episode, Gene and I are going to look at 3 recent titles. We're going to begin with a rather interesting book called Bizarre Romance. This is written by Audrey Niffenegger with art by Eddie Campbell. After that, we're going to discuss the first issue of Ed Brisson and Alessandro Micelli's The Ballad of Sang. And then we're going to wrap up with Gideon Falls, number 1, written by Jeff Lemire with art by Andrea Sorrentino. But before we get to that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off cover price, and every single month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover, but occasionally you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
Yep, and as always, it's Bundle Madness at DCB Service. There's a DC Universe New Variant Edition bundle. That one's 45% off. All the other bundles, Marvel, DC, and Valiant, are all 50% off. And those range from just a couple of books for like $3.98 all the way up through the Marvel Legacy bundle, which is $140, but that is 67 books. So that's not bad for 67 comics.
Yeah.
If you're gonna buy all 67 Marvel Legacy bundles from 1 month, but hey, what the heck?
Yeah, well, you know, whether you choose to go big or go small, Gene, people can't beat the discounts at Discount Comic Book Service.
Exactly.
And you know why?
Why?
Because discount is in their name. So they have to discount at great prices. That's dcbservice.com. You gotta go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
And they'll go, again? Boy, they just keep sending us people. Oh, nice. Finally.
Oh, that's special for you, Gene.
Thank
because,
you.
Yeah, you made a comment, I can't remember if it was last week or the week before, about the ka-ching sound effect. So I made sure that I got it, and it's a new play sound.
I'm very glad that I can contribute in such a deep, content, meaningful ways to the podcast.
Oh, well, you know, you and I aren't the only people contributing to this podcast, because over the past week, several others have sent us correspondences, and I think we should share those with our listeners.
Cool. Go ahead.
Mail time. Mail time.
Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
Now, I think this came out soon after we recorded our last episode, although it refers to 2 episodes ago when we did the March Previews catalog. This was
the massive 3-hour preview show.
And they mentioned this. This came on Facebook, and it is from a listener, Eris Katsis, and he writes, "Reason I love the Comics Alternative, number 1134. After almost 3 hours of talking about the solicitations, you, sirs, actually have no problem discussing if Previews is overdoing it by drawing too many parallels to other works for people who like Akira, Domu, Ghost in the Shell, and Something That Escapes My Mind and Escape from New York meets the X-Men. He uses as he remembered that. Or if it had not exceeded the limit. To me, this shows your commitment and pathos about what you do. Another great and informative episode I enjoyed.
Well, thank you very much.
Eris, that is a great comment, and we appreciate you sending it, and it was as much fun sharing that with everyone as it was to initially read it last week, so thank you.
Coolness.
Another message we got just a few days ago, and this is someone who's a longtime listener of the podcast, and I have mentioned before on the show. This is Milton Lawson, and he writes on our Slack channel. If you remember, Gene, several weeks ago I mentioned that Milton had been corresponding with me about the conundrum of what one would call more realistically based comics.
Right.
He didn't like the term slice of life. Do you call it realism or what? And, I'm with him in scratching my head over the best thing to call it. I had fallen back on realism or realistic comics, but even that is unsatisfying. But he writes, the other day I had another half thought on this topic. Perhaps I'm wrong, but as both a film fan and a comics fan, I can't help but think that there's a much stronger tradition in film criticism for identifying trends, subgenres, movements, and affixing a label to it, and then the rest of the film culture adopts it. And I think he's right there. French New Wave cinema, for example, Italian neorealism, cinema verite, etc., etc. So what I think we're looking for here is something similar to cinema verite. I'd almost advocate for calling this stuff comics verite, but it sounds a wee bit pretentious. I think adopting a foreign term might help here. I wonder if there's anything in European comics or manga comics culture that describes that quality we're reaching for. Maybe this half idea could spark you into finding the right term. The quest continues.
Dessiné verite.
Well, because I responded, I said, I have no problem with comics verite, and it's much more, I think, appropriate than some of the other terms. But if you do want a, as he put it, a foreign sounding word, then dessiné verite. That's good.
It's got a good beat, and I can dance to it.
Mm-hmm. So, Milton, thank you again for this correspondence. And as you point out at the end of that message, the quest continues. Let's keep on talking.
Sounds good.
And then the final piece of correspondence we've gotten over the past week came to us via email. And this is from Megan Sweeney. She is an associate professor at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. So she's in my home state and actually in Wilmington. So, hey, great. She gets to live right at the coast. And Megan writes, not just to you and me, Gene, but also to Gwen, because she listens to the Young Reader Show. Hi, Gwen and the two guys. I'm an English professor at UNC Wilmington, where I teach courses in children's literature and more. I'm teaching a good number of comics this semester, and I've appreciated your podcast. Right now, I'm listening to the episode with Andrew Aiden and Nate Powell, who are my heroes, along with John Lewis. So that was a show from a couple of years ago when Kunka and I interviewed those guys. A few weeks ago, when the Parkland Massacre happened, I was teaching March. I kept thinking, we need to get this book into the hands of high school students. I've started a fundraiser to get these books to Parkland in a way that is non-disruptive to the school I found to contact, as well as to underfunded high schools in other parts of the country. I think it's the most important book anyone can read right now. Most exciting, I've been in touch with Andrew Aiden, who has been very kind about this and has even made a generous donation. If you could spread the word as you see fit, I'd be most grateful. I'm trying to reach out to people who truly understand the power of comics to change the world. And then she gives a link to her GoFundMe page where she is accepting donations to help get March out to a variety of different high schools.
Nice.
Yes. And so if listeners want to find out more about this, and we think you should, go to this website. We will put this in the show notes as well. It's www.gofundme.com/march-for-them. That's www.gofundme.com /march-for-them. And again, I'll put that URL in the show notes so you can just go to that and then click on over. This is a very worthy cause. I appreciate not only Megan sending us the mail, but also helping to share this idea. So let's get the word out there. All listeners, share it with your friends, your family members, and GoFundMe for March for Them.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea, and it's a great book. It's again, I know I've said this before, if not here, shouting it on the street corners. But March is one of those rare comics that is important not just because of its subject matter, although that clearly is important, obviously, but it's also really, really good comic. It's not just a good comic about a great topic. It's a great comic about a great topic. It is good comics. It's thoughtful in what it does with the form, and it allows you to get the messages, I think, even more directly because of how smartly it presents its information.
Yeah, and on past episodes of the Comics Alternative, we did review, I think, the second and third books. We didn't review the first one, and I can't remember why. Maybe just there's so much to discuss and every week, but that fell through the cracks for us, at least at the time that it was initially released. But it's a great series, and Megan, thank you for sharing this information. We wish you the best of luck, and we'll do our best to spread the news about your GoFundMe project.
Excellent. Thank you for writing.
Okay, Gene, let's get into the discussion part of this week's episode, and we're going to begin with a rather interesting book, Bizarre Romance, and this is written by Audrey Niffenegger with art by Eddie Campbell. And this came out, or is coming out, from Abrams ComicArt when this episode goes up. Or actually, today as we record this, March 20th. So it's released today. And when this episode goes up on March 21st, it will have been one day old. So people can go out and get it after hearing this review discussion.
I was going to say, and not only is it being released today, right this very minute as we are recording, the Audrey and Eddie are doing a book signing a couple of miles away from where I am right now. Because they are Chicagoites now, and they're doing a book signing at a local bookstore in northern Chicago.
So maybe we'll get some good vibrations.
That would be great.
Or since you're in Chicagoland, you'll get the vibrations.
Exactly.
Do good vibrations transfer across state lines?
Well, that's you'd have to ask the Beach Boys.
Yeah, and if they do resonate over state lines, I wonder if it sounds like a theremin.
I was trying to get a theremin in there, and I didn't, so I'm glad you did.
Well, this is actually the second week in a row that you and I have mentioned the theremins. Wow. I wish I had that sound effect queued up.
Oh, just sample that.
Yeah. Okay, so I've said a couple times that this is a rather unusual book, and the thing that's unusual about it is I don't know if we would call this a comic or a graphic novel, your term of choice, in the traditional sense. There are parts of it that are very much comics-like, if not straight-out comics, unambiguously so, but other parts of it that are much more prosy than anything. Some things are short stories, which Eddie Campbell illustrates, and some are stories that have been transformed and adapted into comics form, where basically all the words are hers and all the drawings are his, but the two combine to tell the story, probably by getting rid of the he says and she says and things like that. I'm not sure exactly how their collaboration works, but I know that in some of the notes there in the book, I believe she says that a couple of the comic stories were originally published as prose, so they weren't necessarily written to be comics, but then Eddie Campbell works to adapt them that way. So yeah, it's a collection of short stories in prose and comics. That's what I would call it. Right. And in fact, in her 2-page introduction to this collection, she basically gives us the origin story of how this book came about. She said, at least as of the writing of this introduction, that a few months ago she and Eddie Campbell got married, but before that they had a long-distance romance, a very long-distance romance, because she lived in Chicago, he was in Australia, in Brisbane, and while they were apart, at one point they collaborated on, I guess, what turned out to be the very first story in this collection, which is titled Thursdays, 6 to 8 p.m. And so she talks about how that was something that she had written, but she tossed it to Campbell to see what he could do with it in terms of the art. And then that was published in, I guess, The Guardian. They had a special section called Novelists Do Comics, and that was a success. And they really enjoyed working together like that. And then eventually they decided to do this entire book where Niffenegger would take some of her stories, some of which, as you pointed out, Gene, had previously been published as prose short stories, some not. And Campbell worked with illustrating those, and sometimes the illustrations look very much like comics. At other times, it's more just illustrations to accompany the prose, and sometimes even sparingly images that, or sparingly using images to illustrate the stories. So you don't have much of Campbell at all. So it is really a mixed bag. And in fact, one way of looking at this collection, Bizarre Romance, is to look at the various stories on a continuum, more like comics or less like comics.
Yeah, you could do that. Although, again, it's interesting because even though Eddie Campbell is known as in some ways as a collaborator, especially on From Hell with Alan Moore, but I still think of him primarily as a all around cartoonist who writes and draws all his own stuff, because the things I've liked from him best have been pure Eddie Campbell. Right. The Alec books, the Bacchus series, which I bought every single issue of that, in many different permutations. So it's interesting to see the narratives are all from her point of view, and then what he's doing is he's adding another layer of interpretation on top of them in different ways. And again, sometimes, like you said, you see more of him, the ones that are much more comics based. I mean, there are some that he even hand letters, which I love his lettering also. But every one of these stories looks a little bit different, whether it's a prose piece or whether it's a comics piece, because some of the prose is more or less heavily illustrated with using spot illustrations. And then some of the comics look a lot more like a kind of what I would call a traditional Eddie Campbell comic. Mm-hmm. And some look slick in ways that I haven't seen him work before. But I think it's, again, what he's doing, he's adapting the tone of the story through the way that he's drawing also.
Yeah, exactly. And, when I said earlier that one way of looking at this collection of stories is along that continuum, more like comics or less like comics, that's not the only way to look at these stories. It's just I was suggesting one way to see them. But you're right. There's a variation of styles of Campbell's art. And it's interesting, as you were saying this a moment ago, I was flipping through, and it is striking to see the difference and there are 3 stories that I'm using it as example, but you could easily look at others. The very first story, Thursdays, 6 to 8 p.m., that style, Campbell's illustration style, is quite a bit different than that in the very last story in this collection, Backwards in Seville. And then both of those are quite different from a story that appears somewhere in the middle, almost exactly the middle. Jacob Wawilowski and the Angels, which, for my money, is one of the funniest stories in this collection.
Yeah, that's a very odd one, and that one, it's the drawing style it's interesting because the character work is almost naive, sort of. I mean, the main character is very kind of cartoony, even down to the unreal way that the patterns work on his plaid jacket and stuff like that, and then and then that kind of simplicity is juxtaposed with these kind of very medieval and almost medieval / Egyptian drawings of angels. Mm-hmm. They feel, a couple of them felt a little kind of hybridy that way, just between the style of the drawing versus the poses and things like that. But yeah, it's a story that moves on a bunch of different levels, and even the art is working on a couple of different levels there too, within that same within one story.
Right. And I chose that as an example because that style of Campbell's is quite a bit different from those other two examples, the very first and the very last story in this collection. But again, you can pick out several other stories that are also quite different in terms of the art. I mean, the one that, I guess two after this, Motion Studies, Getting Out of Bed, is another one that shows a different side of Campbell. But
that was one of my favorites also.
It was. But I want to go back to this Jacob Wibolowski and the Angels because, again, it's just one of the funniest ones. Now, all of the stories, as Niffenegger points out in her introduction, are a little off-kilter when it comes to issues of romance. All of the stories have something to do with romance, and in a way, I wish this had been released about a month and a half ago, Gene, when we were doing our Valentine's Day special. But as the title of this book suggests, all the stories have something bizarre to say about romance. And here is no exception, because the premise of this short story is that Jacob has angels up in his attic, and they're playing their harps, they're making a lot in horns, and they're making a lot of noise. He can't get any sleep, he can't rest. And as he says at one point, they've come back. So apparently he has had infestation problems with angels in the past. And he called the pest controller that helped him previously get rid of them, called Nate's Speedy Pest Control, but they're no longer apparently around. The business is not there anymore. He calls other exterminators, and they won't take on this project. He does find one, though, who will come over for an extra fee and get rid of the angels. And I love the name of this exterminator, Mr. Death's Complete, Compleat, Exterminators. And when they come over, their logo, which is on the side of their van, is this skeleton in an undertaker's suit and tall stovetop hat holding a gun to a roach who is on the ground begging for his life. Mr. Death's Complete Exterminators.
Yeah, and of course it's family owned and operated since 1888, and you kind of get the feeling that the logo hasn't really changed all that much.
Exactly.
It's almost and the skeleton head. It's almost like a Posada drawing, like the Mexican Day of the Dead drawing.
Yeah.
But although it's a little small to see that, but I'm just gonna put that out there that's what I'm seeing.
Yes, and I don't want to go beyond the premise because then I'll start spoiling much of the joy that I think readers will find in this story. But that's just one of several really interesting and offbeat stories in this collection.
Yeah, I wanted to talk just really briefly about one of the, I think it's the longest prose story, Secret Life with Cats.
Oh yeah,
I enjoyed this story a lot. It's again, I believe it's the longest prose story in here. It's at least a dozen pages long, and it starts off with this very kind of a haunting 2-page spread of like these kind of almost like ghostly cats walking up towards a house, and just the way that he uses color to delineate the space around the cats versus the cats themselves. All that is really beautiful. And then as you go through the story on every 2-page spread, because this is again it's an illustrated short story. So every 2-page spread has at least one drawing on it. You have one page that has like 3 of the cats on it or whatever, or even maybe just like an initial capital, like when it's almost like an illuminated manuscript in that way, where every like kind of a pause in the story when we come back to it with a capital, the capital is kind of illustrated somehow, and you get through, and I'm reading this, and I go through, and I go through, and I go through, and finally I get to 2 pages. There's a 2-page spread, page 46 and 47. There are no drawings on that spread at all, and I just picked it up right away because it was the only time in the story that I hadn't seen Eddie Campbell's existence on the page, and I saw that, I was like, oh. This is, I think something significant is going to happen here because he's choosing not to show me anything at all. Mm-hmm. And this is a page with a big reveal.
Right.
And I just thought that was interesting that he's using those illustrations to kind of give flavoring to things, but it's like holding back to say, okay, and just visually you can tell something big is going to happen because you don't see anything happening.
You know, I'm glad that you pointed that out because I wondered about that myself. The fact that this is the 2-page spread where we have none of Campbell's illustrations. And I wondered when I read this, was this just a coincidence that in this part of the story we don't have any illustrations? Or does the absence of illustration draw our attention to, as what you called, the big reveal in this story? And we don't want to say anything about it because then we'd be spoiling it. But I think I would like to think that the absence of images was intentional.
Oh yeah, definitely. And again, there's a couple other prose stories in there, and there are some places where like there are no words on those pages either, or at least just one capital but nothing else. But this one, it just seems so stark because there are no other completely gray two-page gray spread anywhere. Yes,
and this is a really interesting story, and what we have is it's a first-person narrative, and the woman who tells this story, her name is Beatrice. We learn fairly early on that she doesn't have a bad marriage, but her husband, who used to teach at a university, becomes a realtor and gets really involved in his work as a realtor to the point that he's spending more time focusing on his job than his life at home. But that doesn't seem so much to upset her. But when he starts getting more involved in the work, then she decides to go out and do something on her own. So she ends up volunteering at a cat shelter. And she meets an older woman by the name of Ruth. They develop a very close relationship. And then something happens to Ruth that becomes a significant turning point for Beatrice.
Right, yeah. And it's pretty obvious, I think, what's going to happen at one point, but then as things progress and as she discovers this house with its various secrets, we kind of just dive further into those secrets until different things are revealed in non-standard ways, let's say.
Yeah. It may be the second longest primarily prose piece in this collection, if I'm not mistaken. Comes toward the end, and this is one where, you do have 2-page spreads, and in fact, a good bit of the story where there's no illustration whatsoever. And this one's called The Wrong Fairy. Mm-hmm. And, whereas Secret Life with Cats takes place in a more contemporary setting, this one takes place in the last part of the 19th century during the Victorian period. And it is about an artist who has a problem with alcohol abuse, ends up in a sanitarium, and as the title may suggest, there are fairies involved.
Right, and I don't know how deep we want to get into that, but I realized pretty quickly who our protagonist had to be. I had one thought at first, and then I was like, no, it can't be him. But then I said, oh, it's his father.
Yeah.
And the late Victorian setting with fairies might set off some bells for people. But I thought that was interesting. At first, I was wondering if he was just riffing on the idea of kind of the fairy madness that happened with the advent of photography as well. But it's much more than that. I'm not sure. One nice thing about this book is that she does provide notes in the back about all the different stories as well, the publishing history. Mm-hmm. And this one, she does give an inspiration, one of the sources for the story as well. So it's most of the things here are either pure fiction or sort of maybe slightly disguised roman à clef or something like that. This is one that's actually based on a kind of research.
Mm. And as we pointed out, and as Niffenegger mentions in the intro, I mean, these are all rather bizarre stories. And so when they get really weird and wacky, I tend to like them even more. And one of the early stories, and this is more of a work of comics than, let's say, traditional prose like some of the others that we've discussed. This one's titled Rose Red Snow Riding Beauty Shoes Hood Sleeping White. And as the title may suggest, it has everything to do with fairy tales, or at least someone who, as the story starts, is very much thinking about these kind of folk tales or fairy tales. And then where she ends up is really strange. And I'm not giving anything away here, but she's with, I guess, her brother. They're looking for costumes to go to a Halloween party. And it looks like that she's dressed somewhat like Red Riding Hood. But again, there's a reference to some of these other, female fairy tale characters. She's standing in front of a mirror, but then, like Alice, she ends up stepping through the mirror, and then things get really weird. And I don't know, that struck me as something like a Twilight Zone episode, or it's something that could easily be turned into a Twilight Zone episode.
Yeah, definitely. Back when I was teaching children's literature, I would always do a unit on fairy tales, and just the way that different tales have been adapted over time. And I would have loved to have used this to kind of wrap up that unit as well, because it's playing with a lot of fairy tale tropes, but like a lot of adult literature that references fairy tales, it takes some of those themes, but it moves them in different kind of, not just small A adult directions, with a little more kind of worldly concerns and things like that. But it's nice. The title alone made me laugh because I realized exactly what I was in for, and I was not disappointed.
Yeah, and also like a lot of the at least original fairy tales, this one doesn't really end on an upbeat note, and there's something rather dark and disturbing about it. And I appreciated that. Yeah,
definitely.
I like it dark and disturbing.
Yeah, and one of the things that when after Ross goes through the mirror and she kind of is in this other world, I really, really, really love the tiny unicycles. There's no reason for them, but I mean the denizens of this world they're almost Hieronymus Bosch like faces on some of them, not all of them, but some of them. They seem like they come from many different visual traditions, but a hell of a lot of them, for some reason, are on these kind of standing it's almost like a pogo stick unicycle thing. And it's a dumb, tiny little thing, but it just makes it that much more off.
Yeah. And even the guy that Roz ends up marrying, he is on a unicycle, but the way that it's drawn, the unicycle is attached to what looks like his tie. In other words, there's a tie that comes down, but then eventually it turns into a unicycle, and that's right. How he is standing, or at least up above the ground on the wheel, on the unicycle. It's just really weird.
Perhaps he has no. Perhaps he was born with Leuchner's disease and has no spine. Yeah. And this thing,
sorry, or he has no weight.
That reached back for a while. But I also like the fact that his hair is it's more than a little Eddie Campbell.
Yes.
That's very much. And another thing. And another really small thing I liked about this story is the second and third page of it, where there's something with an apple, which again we've got apples have multiple signifiers in here between. I think that works in several different levels. But the first panel there, he handed her a wax apple. Then she does some things with it. And then at the bottom of the next page, as she goes through the mirror, that apple is there, but it's not actually in the panel; it's below the panel. And that reminds me a lot of. Did you read his? I forget the full title, but the Monsieur Leotard book.
No, I didn't.
That he did. This was maybe 10 or 15 years ago. It was like The Amazing Adventures of Monsieur Leotard, and it was like almost a proto superhero. Sort of French Victorian-ish story. I'm getting all the words wrong because I haven't read it in a long time. But a lot of things in that book, he was doing a lot of things where actions would happen not just in between the panels, but like in the borders. Like there'd be like a standard comic story in panels on the page, but then in the margins, more things would be happening. Almost like Marginalia, or almost like Sergio Aragonés in Mad, doing little unrelated drawings, but in that book, he was doing a lot of things where elements from previous in the book would show up again, or he's doing a lot of weird kind of meta things just with the layout. And this was just one little thing that reminded me of that.
Mm.
Again, it means nothing, but it just reminded me of that because I just admire so much the way that Eddie Campbell constructs his pages, and that was just a little reminder of something else.
Another story that deals with fairies. Actually, there are a lot of fairies in this collection. But another one, because we've talked about at least a couple already, but this one is, I don't know, about a third of the way in. The Ruin of Grant Lowry.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and this is a story about a guy, Grant, who is sitting at the bar of a place called the Village Tap, and a woman comes over to him and wants him to come to their table. This woman is sitting with two others, and in essence, what they're wanting him to do is to choose one of them to live with for the next year, because they are fairies, and as one would do with an exchange student, they want to immerse themselves in the world of humans, and the best way of doing that is to live with them. And so it's just like, if you want to learn a language, then you go to that country, you immerse yourself in that culture, and that's the best way of learning the language. And so they want to do something similar, but it's something that goes awry, as one would expect.
Yeah, exactly. And this one is interesting again visually, because the drawings are kind of flat.
Yes.
In a way that his stuff generally isn't, between color and even drawing style. The three fairies themselves are drawn in very different styles. Our main character is he's a little bit of a mullet-wearing, handsome lad. And one of the fairies looks like her face is always changing, and it's like a,
she's cubist at one point.
At one point she becomes almost cubist.
Yeah, she's very asymmetrical.
Asymmetrical, yes. And in this one, it's using typeset text as well instead of his handwriting. Like the word balloons are all in italics, and then there's a lot of there's more textual narration in this one. It's still clearly comics, but there's more written text in it, and it's actually typeset, which actually makes it look kind of strange compared to some of the other ones, because again, for Eddie Campbell, his drawing and his handwriting just go hand in hand for me. So as an Eddie Campbell fan, this looked weird to me at first. It set me off kilter. I knew something different was happening, because it just doesn't look like Eddie.
Yeah, well, another story that also uses typeset for font is later in the book, Digging Up the Cat. In fact, this is one that Niffenegger dedicates to her father, Larry.
Right.
And this does seem like an autobiographical story, and it could be, I don't know, but it seems like something that could be. And basically, this is the story of a woman who digs up one of her former cats that had died relatively young, and she's digging the cat up now because that cat's sibling had lived on, but had recently died. And so in order to kind of wait for, when the ground thaws, because apparently her most recent cat dies in the winter, she puts the sibling cat in her freezer, and then when things get warmer, she digs up the older cat that had died, or the cat that had died previously, and then moves the remains around to make room for the sibling that has recently died. And the whole idea about digging up a cat, keeping a cat in your freezer, I know people do that, but it just seems a little strange. But I think it's supposed to seem strange.
Yeah, but it's strange, but it's also, I found it to be really heartfelt at the same time.
Yeah. I don't mean to suggest that this is strange as in it really puts me off, but it's strange is that not a lot of people do this, and having a dead cat in your freezer for a while, I don't know, it strikes me as a little unusual. But you're right. I mean, there is quite a bit heartfelt about this, which is another thing that led me to read this as probably one of the closest to an autobiographical narratives that we have in this collection.
Right, yeah. And this one, again, because it's set up as basically a series of 4-panel pages all the way as we go through. And the end is really kind of a kicker. And the very last panel, there's not even a panel border. It's just a short sentence with just white space around it. And I thought that was a really effective way to move from this kind of a moment to moment thing that had been going on, telling us every step of the way here, to suddenly a kind of almost existential nothingness. And that's really where she is at the time, at the end of the story itself. So I thought, again, that's taking what the story would work fine in prose, definitely, but it's one of the things where a good cartoonist is able to take things further in a different way, again, without probably changing a single word at all, because everything would be basically the same as it would have been in just a regular prose story. But the layout, even the fact that there isn't an image, becomes striking.
You know, it's interesting the way that you were reading and then interpreting that last panel, which is really, as you point out, no panel, just words. I mean, I read that you referred to it as kind of a nothingness because that seems to be what she's feeling at the time. And I agree. It seems to be what she's feeling at the time. I read that's the last panel and the final words of it in a more optimistic way, because instead of seeing it as nothingness, I saw the lack of panel and illustration as openness. And so what we have is, in contrast to, as you mentioned, the moment-by-moment telling of this narrative, we have a projection into a yet-to-be-determined future time where there may be a chance for healing.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I guess you're looking at where the story or where the character is moving after the story. And I was just thinking back to the moment in the story right there. Again, both perfectly valid. Neither one of them is right or wrong or negates the other one. Mm-hmm. But it's just a way of thinking that for me, I immediately thought about the sadness that it entails. But you're right, at the same time, because it's entailing the sadness in the past, but it's also promising that that's going to change.
Yeah. The story that follows this, The Church of the Funnies, I really like it. And this is one of those pieces that is primarily, and in this case, almost exclusively prose. And in fact, the only Campbell illustrations we get, there is a 2-page spread that opens the story. And that's quite striking. I want to talk about that a bit. But there's only one other illustration, and that is on the first page where you begin with the prose. Other than that, we have no images in this story. Right. Now, in that 2-page spread, what's notable is you have the speaker of this story, who is a woman, standing in front of a congregation, and she is apparently giving a sermon, as we will find out as we begin reading. And in the congregation is a collection of classic comics characters, at least in terms of primarily American comics. And I really appreciated that. I mean, we have Blondie, we have Nancy and Sluggo, Popeye, Little Orphan Annie, so on and so forth. And it's for this reason that I regret the fact that we don't have more illustrations from Campbell, especially given the fact that comics or in art in general is referenced throughout.
Yeah, I think part of that might be the fact that it's a sermon. So it's kind of keeping the oral tradition there. You're focusing just on the words. I mean, that could just be making that up. But yeah, I on the one hand, I would love to see all that, but on the same token, I loved this story so much. Again, that opening 2-page spread is funny. It's nice to see Nancy and Sluggo sitting in between Mary Worth and Blondie. There's things like that. So the nice little juxtaposition of things there. Hagar the Horrible in the front row of a church. I'm not quite sure Hagar knows what's going on. But just the way that she talks about a kind of spirituality, and just the way she goes through her own thought process and what art means to her. And I've just found myself kind of nodding a lot of the way through as we go through it. And not just because she ends on Star Wars. I would have been perfectly happy with no Star Wars references at all. Yeah. But she even ends on Star Wars like, oh God, it's like if I could write, I would love to have written Church of the Funnies.
Yeah. And she's in making this juxtaposition between, let's say, Christianity, or at least classic religious thought in the West, and the Church of the Funnies, she points out that, whereas we have with the classic 7 deadly sins, lust, envy, sloth, wrath, gluttony, greed, and pride, we have in the Church of the Funnies, the 7 deadly sins are unoriginality, dishonesty, censorship, banality, sentimentality, egotism, and selling out. And then she goes on to list the virtues of art: humility, patience, originality, openness, generosity, diligence, and gratitude. And that's just the tip of what the narrator of this story, and then Niffenegger as the writer, does in terms of giving us this sermon which glorifies the quote-unquote religion of art.
Yeah, and that very paragraph that you just pointed to right there, that's the one place where we got hard copies of this book, and I've got flags throughout. This is the one flag that not only did I flag that, but I put a little star on it. It's like that, that. I mean, literally, that's like the one thing that I did, the one piece of writing that I did, which is I put a star in this one. This is the thing that I want to keep in mind. Mm-hmm. I was just really, really freaking impressed with that story.
Yeah, and the story that follows that, it's the last one of the collection. I've already mentioned the title, Backwards in Seville. It does have a markedly different art style than many of the other stories in this collection. And I don't want to give anything away about how it ends, but the way it ends was quite effective. Again, I don't want to say too much, but I think that was a really good and poignant story to end on. Yeah,
no, absolutely right. And yeah, it's really hard to talk about it without kind of giving that one away, but it's very ruminative. Are there any speech bubbles in this one at all? One. The rest of it is just, there's a couple more, but it's mostly just narration. It's rumination. Mm-hmm. But it's from a third-person point of view. There's a bunch. I'm a liar. There's speech balloons all over the place.
Yeah.
But there's still a lot of narration. What's going on inside the main character's head, primarily.
Yeah, and in fact,
it's much more internal.
Right, and this is one of those stories that kind of combines the more prose-heavy stuff with the more comics-like selections in this collection, and so it kind of brings the two together, because this is one that's sort of kind of like comics, but at the same time, not entirely.
So it's totally comics.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's
play the definition game. It's totally comics.
But it's doing some very different things than many of the other stories in this collection do. And I mean, we can talk a little bit about the premise. And basically, according to the narration, we have a daughter going with her father on a cruise not too long after the mother has passed. And as she tells us early on, or as we learn early on, the father used to go on cruises with his wife when she was alive. But now the mother is no longer with them, and so it's the daughter who accompanies the father. And this is the setup of this story.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of it takes place kind of on the boat, with her kind of looking out and thinking about a wide variety of things.
Right. Now, without giving anything away about what happens at the very end of this tale, I will say that the title, Backwards in Seville, becomes very important. Backwards in Seville. And then I'll leave it at that.
There you go. And there's one last thing I wanted to point out, because I know we need to move on. But one of the early short stories, which is just hilarious, is called The Composite Boyfriend, where basically the narrator, and it could be all her, I have no idea. But she just describes every boyfriend she's had, but all at the same time. Mm-hmm. It was 1985. It was 1985. It was 1997. It was 1992. It was 1996. It was 2001. It was spring, winter, summer, autumn, winter. That's a whole paragraph. And everything works like that. The sex was great. The sex was okay. The sex was a huge problem. And it just kind of builds on like this. It becomes a very bizarre portrait of, again, what's theoretically a composite boyfriend, just like all these different kind of men and all the different ways that relationships can get screwed up and people can be screwed up. But what I really love is what Eddie Campbell does for this. The title page, the 2-page spread that opens it, is a paper doll of the composite boyfriend. So we got a paper doll in here, which is a very fine comics tradition as we go through. But this is one of your goofier paper dolls as well, because there's very little I think that she mentions in the prose that actually gets illustrated in the paper dolls. The paper doll is just as wacky as you can get. The headgear goes from like a Magritte's bowler hat to Donald Trump's hair to Indian chief's headdress. The shoes are insane. One of them is a pair of high heels. There are different forms of genitalia for the boyfriend. But my favorite thing is the very first things that we see there. There is a brain and there is a squirrel, which is the same size as the brain. It's so ridiculously stupid, and I just loved it.
And that's the one item that you apparently can't cut out and place on the boyfriend, or if you did, I mean, there's no place for it attached to. Yeah, no tabs.
Right. Yeah. So it's external or it's assumed, but the fact that, I mean, there's two different kinds of hearts. There's a Valentine heart and an actually anatomically correct heart. Mm-hmm. Robot legs.
Yeah,
a saxophone.
I thought you were going to say the robot legs were your favorite.
Yeah, no. I love the robot legs, obviously, but then you got like for the mouth, you can put in a saxophone, a pipe, or like a hayseed kind of a
piece of
grass thing sticking out. Yeah. But the squirrel juxtaposed with the brain just made me laugh out. It was a literal lol moment.
Mm. Yeah, it's something that I think both of us would highly recommend to listeners. Although, again, it's not your traditional comic or graphic novel. It's very different. And if nothing else, I think it's interesting because in reading it, it does indirectly ask you to challenge your own definition of comics.
Yeah, and well, I was kind of being sarcastic before about the definition question. I just enjoyed reading these stories for what they were. Mm-hmm. And again, it's an anthology that has some comics, some prose, some things we may want to say that's on a continuum, but it's all kind of a piece because of Audrey Niffenegger's authorial voice. And then Campbell's art comes in and does different things to those stories depending on the needs of that particular story. So it's called bizarre romance, but to me it's called bizarre romance, but it's a perfect blending of an author and an illustrator who are very in sync with each other.
Right, and in love with one another.
Exactly.
Yes. So now, had you heard of Audrey Niffenegger before this?
I've heard of her. I mean, I worked in a public library, so we had all like Time Traveler's Wife and things like that. I remember when The Night Bookmobile came out, which was like her first illustrated book, and I would like to read it again because I read it the first time and it didn't really do much for me. And and I don't remember any details about it really, but after reading this book and enjoying this so much, I want to go back and reread The Night Bookmobile because I clearly think my head was in the wrong place then because I really enjoyed every single one of these stories.
Yeah, I did as well. This was my introduction to her writing and she's definitely piqued my interest now.
Yeah, definitely. And Eddie Campbell again is to our audience should be very, very well known. This should not be. Yeah, we would hope. But if you need an introduction to Eddie Campbell, this is not a bad one. Yeah. But hopefully you'll be able to see this and just see him doing things and working in collaboration in different ways. You see different facets of his storytelling skills. Mm-hmm.
And again, we want to thank the good people at Abrams ComicArt for sending us copies of this, and they did a good job. Thank you, guys.
Yes, thank you. Oh, and again, you can follow them online. Audrey Niffenegger's website is audreyniffenegger.com, and Eddie Campbell's new website is eddiecampbelldammit.com.
Okay, we're going to shift gears a little bit. Now we're going to focus on issue number 1 of Ed Brisson and Alessandro Micelli's The Ballad of Sang. This came out the first week of March 7th, from Oni Press. I'm not sure how many issues are planned in this series. Did you see any information about that?
No, because we've got a kind of a publisher's preview of it, so it doesn't have everything in it. There's no indicia, so it's hard to tell. Yeah, in fact, I want to, not as if people in the publicity department at Oni are listening to this, but they could be, who knows. First and foremost, we very much appreciate you sending us several weeks ago this pre-release of issue number 1 of Ballad of Sang, because it made this show possible. On the other hand, I do want to mention a couple of things that made appreciating this comic a little challenging at times. Maybe challenging is the most strategic way I can put this. I'm not a big fan of watermarks in review copies of digital comics. I understand why publishers do that. It makes taking in the fullness of the comic a little difficult. And it's not just getting the story, right? It's looking at the art and seeing what that does along with the narrative, but then in its own right. And sometimes with heavy watermarks, that can become a little bit difficult. Another thing about this review copy, and we don't get many review copies like this from Oni, but at the bottom of every page is this little image that lets us know the Ballad of Sang number 1, order code, and then we have the order code. Now, I know why they're doing it, but again, that was on every single page of this digital early release. And honestly, Gene, it detracted from my appreciation or my enjoyment of this first issue. I mean, I liked it well enough, but those little bits, the watermark and then the order code that is all over the place, kind of took away from the reading. Well, it didn't for me quite so much, just because I understood the reason behind it, and it's generally not covering anything that's too important. Although I at the same time, I think every square inch of art does matter.
Yeah.
But and the watermark thing, but it's not the worst watermark that I've seen. I just remember when we did the Milk and Cheese book, that one, like the watermark on that made it almost impossible to read some of that stuff.
Oh yeah. And with Dark Horse, many times, I think they've gotten better in terms of their review copy, digital review copy watermarks, but, I'd forgotten about that. Now, I don't want to make it sound as if I'm griping too much or looking a gift horse in the mouth. Again, as I said at the outset, I very much appreciate the people at Oni getting us an early digital review copy of this. But, okay, so outside of my little nitpicks, which may sound ungrateful, what did you think of this first issue of the series? It's
kind of like a rogue. It becomes sort of like a rogue assassin story, sort of, and the story itself to me wasn't as interesting as the art and the storytelling in it. Mm-hmm. I like the storytelling, I think, better than I like the story itself, if that makes sense. Yeah, I like there's some really nice kinetic scenes. Again, it's the story itself. It's not like I've read it before, but I've read things like it before, to a certain extent. But like the main character, Sang, he almost looks like one of the gorillas from Jamie Hewlett, which is kind of fun that way. He's a mute character, and there's some actual sign language happening when Sang talks, when Sang communicates, because we have that's kind of drawn out for us, and so that's interesting to look at. And some of the pages themselves, the color work is really interesting. The layouts kind of vary a lot as we go through. Mm-hmm. It's very the energetic scenes are very energetic,
right?
And sometimes to like a cartoony level, but that's where the story is.
Well, Ed Brisson, I saw a couple of interviews, or at least one interview, where he talks about this, And he mentions that much of it was influenced by his love of 70s and 80s action films or kung fu movies, those kind of things. And you can definitely see that in this first issue. And I was thinking about that when you mentioned the kind of cartoony action violence that's going on. And so some of that, I think, over-the-topness is reminiscent of 70s and 80s action, kung fu, what have you, kind of films. And so there's a lot of that there. Now, this is a story in, I don't know, we're going to talk about the first issue of Gideon Falls in a moment, and so I don't want to jump ahead. But I will mention that I read Gideon Falls #1 before I read The Ballad of Sang #1, and as we can discuss in a moment, Gideon Falls #1 is quite a substantial first issue. And so I guess I was thinking when I picked up this first issue of Ballad of Sang, maybe it'll be chunky and a substantial first issue as well. It's regular length, but because of the action scenes, it seemed to go by much quicker. And so by the time I got to the end of this first issue, it's like, oh, is that all? But I guess it's because of the action that I felt that way. So it seems that not much happens, but actually it's a significant setup to what I assume will be the premise of what will unfold. Now, Gene, you had mentioned that our main character, Sang, the young boy, is mute. He's not only mute, but he is a very effective fighter. And so it starts off with him going to a group, the Yakuza, and he's asking for their leader, a guy by the name of Sato, and he has a message for Sato from Don Micelli. And Don Micelli is wanting his money, but he's also wanting one of Sato's pinkies because he didn't give back the money to the Don quickly enough. And so Sang does what he assumes to be his job. What he does, and I don't want to give too much away here, leads to what happens toward the end of this first issue. When Sang leaves Sato and his group, he goes back home where he has his mentor, a man by the name of Chen. And, it's kind of a classic kung fu relationship, right? You have the older master, you have the young disciple. At least that seems to be the relationship. And then things take a much darker turn in the last half of this issue.
Yeah, it's awful dark. Yeah, and it just and the way we end, it looks like it's not going to get any lighter. It's only going to get there's no hope at the end of this chapter. It's just like we're going to get deeper into the shit.
Yeah. Now, are you a fan of Ed Brisson? Have you read many of his other comics?
I do not recognize the name at all.
Okay. Now, he is, I guess over the past few years, has been doing a number of things with Marvel, but because I don't read Marvel much, I'm much more familiar with his creator-owned stuff that he's done for, let's say, Image or Oni or Boom. In titles that I'm familiar with, he did a collection, an anthology about crime comics called The Murder Book, interestingly enough. But he also did some really good series. There were a few over at Image from the past several years: Sheltered, The Field, The Mantle, The Violent, and then at other publishers he's done Cluster. And I had him on the show when he did The Last Contract and had just started The Violent at the same time, both different publishers. I think The Last Contract was, I can't remember, either Boom or Oni. So this is, I don't know, I think of Ed Brisson as a journeyman writer. And what I mean by that, he is someone who can write, maybe not in every kind of genre. There's several, though, that seem to define his kind of work. But he can write in a variety of styles, various genres, different kinds of stories. He can go from one publisher to the next. And he's someone who competently handles whatever it is he's writing. Now, again, I haven't read his more, I guess, mainstream superhero stuff, and I'm sure he handles that as well. But he's a really solid writer.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting that you said that you thought that this book read a lot more quickly than than the next one that we're going to talk about, because I think there's like maybe 2 or 3 times as much dialogue in this book minimum as there is in the other one. The other one, to me, it's much more, it's more about mood and setting a tone. This one is very much about narrative. But again, like you said, a lot of the narrative is kind of hack slash stuff, but there's still a lot of dialogue happening in this book as well, much more than in our next book.
Which is ironic given the fact that Sang is mute.
Right. Yeah. Well, everybody else talks. He's the eye of the hurricane at this point, basically.
Yeah,
but he's the eye of the hurricane, but he's also the hurricane itself. So everything is whirling around him, but really, he's the one that the insurance is going to have to pay for. Okay,
I want us to put a pin in something that you just said about Gideon Falls, and that is its emphasis on mood. I want to get to that later. But yeah, you're right that Ballad of Sang reads very differently because it's all or primarily plot. Action, 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 action. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that's why it seems such a quick read, because we go, quickly from one panel to the next because it's propelled by movement, action, violence.
Yeah. And the art is really kinetic. I do like the art a lot. Again, just the color palette, just the different layout choices. There's that 2-page spread early on, where Sang is just hacking the heck out of people. And it's all kind of like on a Dutch angle. It looks, it becomes more like comic strip or like film strip or something like that. Almost every panel has a good Batman type sound effect, except they're all squishy sound effects.
Yeah.
But so it's a
schluck, splutch, spl.
Yeah, it's all good squishy sounds.
Good squishy sounds.
Nothing like a good squishy sound.
Yeah. Now, is this a series that you're wanting to continue with? See what happens?
I'd probably wait for the trade on this one, just because I'm a little curious, but I kind of want to see more where it's going a little more. I mean, I know where it's going, but I'd like to see it build up more before I read the next chapter. I'd like to read more of a bunch of it at once.
Yeah, I feel similar. And I mean, I thought that the ending was quite effective because, and again, without giving anything away, what happens with Sang at the very end is in many ways kind of ascending forth. And even though we had a lot of action in this first issue, I can anticipate this at the very end is where things are just beginning now.
Right.
At least that's the sense that I get.
Yeah, and it also has a very big Spider-Man No More vibe to that last page as well.
Yeah, you're right.
I think John Romita, I think it was a Romita who drew that issue. I think Romita should get a little nod on that page.
Well, Gene, you want to move on to the last title that we're discussing this week?
Yeah, and that's Gideon Falls, a new image book written by Jeff Lemire, with art by Andrea Sorrentino, and color by Dave Stewart.
Yes, and this also came out on March 7th, the same week as The Ballad of Sang #1. Almost anything new that Jeff Lemire comes out with, I wanted to discuss on the Comics Alternative, with the exception of Lemire's work, let's say, with DC, or even, or the big two, let's say, because we just don't discuss that. It's part of a mission statement, not because we don't like or we diss the mainstream universes. It's just, if you want a discussion of those comics, there are a ton, not literally, of comics podcasts out there where you can get that stuff. So we're offering something different, right? And Gene, we are probably the only comics-oriented podcast that has discussed and will discuss bizarre romance. I bet you money.
If that's true, number one, yay us, and number two, that makes me very sad.
Yeah, good point. But we definitely like to discuss Jeff Lemire stuff whenever it comes out. And this is one of those titles, like Black Hammer over at Dark Horse, which we've discussed in a past episode, where Lemire's doing the writing but not the art. And the reason I mention that is my love of Jeff Lemire early on was those comics, those stories that he not only wrote but also drew. It's when he was just really getting into comics. And, you know, the classic example of that is the Essex County trilogy.
Yeah, and he's somebody that I'm aware of, but I never really read much of, to be quite honest.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, go back and listen to some of our past episodes. And in fact, last year, Kunka and I had a really fun interview with Lemire. And he actually said a few things on that interview that reminded me of some of the stuff that I see, especially in his final essay in this first issue of Gideon Falls. One of the things he said in that interview, we were asking him about his most recent work, and one of the new titles at the time was Black Hammer. And I think both Andy and I assumed that Black Hammer was something that he began working on, let's say, years after Essex County. But he pointed out, he said, actually, no, Black Hammer was one of the first things he started to envision after Essex County, which is really what put him on the map, which I thought was interesting because he had another book that came out at about the same time that Black Hammer started, a graphic novel called Leatherneck, I believe. That was one of the first, if not the first, books to come out from Simon & Schuster's Gallery 13 imprint. And it has a definite Essex County feel to it, and I just assumed that was something that he started working on right after Essex County, but he said, no, it was Black Hammer. The reason I mention this is because this brief, 3-page essay at the end of this first issue of Gideon Falls, he talks about the origins of Gideon Falls. This is an idea that he has had for years, even before he really got into comics when he was a film student. And so I love this essay because, and maybe by talking about the essay and putting the cart before the horse, because, I'm talking about the essay about the comic before the comic, but I do think that it puts things into some really nice context. He tells us that this is an idea that he's had for a long time, that basically with this new series from Image, he's melding a couple of ideas that he has had into one narrative, which really makes sense, because the way that this story is set up in this first issue, there are at least two things going on, two stories. There's the story of Norton, who is a guy who goes around collecting garbage, who, let's just say, has some issues. And then is it garbage? Okay, yeah, well, good point. We don't know yet. And then it's also the story of a priest, Father Fred, and he has a past, but we don't know much about it. He ends up at a new parish, and there's something a little unusual that happened at this parish, especially with the previous priest, but we don't know much about that as well. So we have these two stories, the story of, Norton, the questionable garbage, quote-unquote, garbage collector, and then Father Fred and what he's doing. And these stories do begin to come together in this first issue, but not completely. But then again, I wouldn't expect them to come together this quickly.
Yeah, no, it's clearly a two-track story, and I didn't get the feeling that it was like two different things melding together. It felt like it was all moving in tandem with each other somehow, even though the settings for the two are very, very different. Gideon Falls, the small town, but also the more urban setting that Frank is in, or no, that. I'm blanking. The
Father Fred,
Father Fred, but and then the garbage man. I'm blanking on the other main character.
Norton.
I blanked on his name. Norton. Just blanked on his name. But yeah, it all feels of a piece, and I think the art has a lot to do with that, because there's a lot of kind of mirroring happening on the pages and things like that. We get to near the end, we get to some intercutting as well, cutting back and forth between the two different characters. And that starts to blend things together that way. Even if they're not in the same place doing the same things, it just again, this is really smart comics. It's visually setting things up in different ways.
Now, are you familiar with the art of Andrea Sorrentino before this?
Nope. I'm the dumbest co-host ever. I know. Every time you ask me those questions, you can almost guarantee my answer is no.
Hey, you know a lot of
really
Eddie Campbell.
Sad. I know. Well, yeah, but there's a lot I don't know. This podcast has taught me that there's a lot that I need to know.
Well, and the reason I mention that is because I think the one work of his that I remember is his work on I, Vampire. This is with the New 52. And I didn't read that series for that long, but I mean, his art did strike me at the time. But he has worked with Jeff Lemire on a couple of other projects that I never read. He did one. He worked with Lemire when Lemire was doing Green Arrow for DC, and then he also worked with Lemire at Marvel with Old Man Logan. So they have a past together, and that's one of the things that Lemire mentions in this brief essay at the very end of the first issue. But again, not having read Old Man Logan, not having kept up with Green Arrow, I only knew Sorrentino's work from those few issues of I, Vampire from a number of years ago.
Okay, yeah, and that's more than I knew.
Yeah, but to me, you mentioned a little while ago when we were discussing Ballad of Song that if action and plot drives the Ballad of Song, it's mood that primarily defines Gideon Falls #1. And I think that for me at least, I mean, the story is definitely significant. I'm hooked with Lemire's writing here, but it is Sorrentino's art that really does cast the mood that had me reading this issue at a slower pace than Ballad of Song, just because of the visuals and what they evoke.
Yeah, it's the art style is it's kind of scratchy, almost to the point where in some places it looks like kind of a overexposed photographs. Although I don't think he's actually doing that, but the art has that kind of feel sometimes of like an overexposed, bleached out photograph. It's been kind of beat around in a couple of places. But yeah, it's very evocative. And I think Dave Stewart's colors do a lot as well. The color palette is doing a lot of the storytelling.
It's very muted, and I think that adds to the mood. Right.
And especially when we get to the cross cutting, the coloring really helps clarify where you are. It's moody. I hate the word moody, but the coloring really does. It's very evocative. Let's put it that way. And when we get to Father Frank's, not necessarily a dream, but there's the color red becomes just so bright in a way that we hadn't really seen before, except in one other place, really. That it just makes that moment even more striking, and that's good color storytelling, I think, definitely.
Yeah, and you mentioned the occasion toward the end of this first issue of Gideon Falls, where Father Fred at first wonders if he's having a dream. It may seem like a dream. Let's just say that there seems to be something rather otherworldly that's going on here. And this is when we get the more rapid-fire cross-cutting between Norton's story and Father Fred's. And you're right, Stewart's color palette really does help us to keep pace with what's going on and who seems to be doing what. And I think this back and forth between one story, the next, one story, the next, leads us to what happens at the very end of this first issue. And I won't say what that is, but it is the big turning point.
Yeah, and I'll just go back to the red again. Just flipping through the book here again once more time. Almost every time something is red, it's super significant.
Right.
There's one taillight on a car that I don't think is, but almost everything else, when we see something that's kind of a clear, flat flat red, that becomes super important, and that just gets reinforced the closer we get towards the end of the book. Also, there's a 2-page spread that is super red.
Yeah, the Black Barn.
The Black Barn page is the reddest page in the book. But again, that's also I'm curious about a lot of things in this book, not because I don't think it was done well, but because I think it was done very well.
Yeah.
A lot of the things that are happening here with why can't I'm blanking on the main character's name again?
Norton?
With the garbage picker. Norton, yeah. So often Norton is depicted.
Just think of the honeymooners.
Norton. That's right. Norton.
One of these days.
Yeah. But he's very often upside down.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure where that comes from. I mean, we know that he's had some mental issues in the past. He's possibly unbalanced in certain ways, but we get a lot of upside down with him. And especially when it gets juxtaposed with a priest, where the priest is right set up and he's upside down, it kind of makes you think about the devil, maybe, because it's like the opposite of the priest. But again, like you said, this priest has some background that we don't quite know about either.
Yeah, there's some things going on with him.
He's been moved around to different places. Before he's here, he's teaching somewhere. So he's like, I'm okay here. I like what I'm doing here, but he also tells Jean later on that he's moved around a lot. He's used to moving around, and whether that's by choice or by being sent places or sent away from places is unclear at this point.
Yeah, and by the way, you mentioned Jean. She is one of his new parishioners, right? So he has been assigned to a particular parish, and Jean greets him when he arrives, and she's asking him, can I help you out? Do you want me to make some tea for you? I can clean up. This is what I did for the previous father who resided here. And then what happens at the very end also includes something with Jean, but we'll just leave it at that.
Right, and she's also, if you've ever seen Father Ted, there's a little of a Mrs. Doyle about her. Oh, are you sure you won't have any tea? She's trying to be very helpful, too helpful for him. He clearly doesn't feel like he needs any help, and she's just trying to be nice. She's not trying to be annoying, but you can tell from his perspective he would just rather be alone, which is an odd thing for a priest who's supposed to be the shepherd of a flock. So it's like he's kind of like just please leave me alone.
Yeah. When we first started talking about Gideon Falls #1, I began by talking about Lemire's three-page essay at the very end of this. I don't know if you felt this, Gene, but I liked the story in this first issue well enough, but then reading Lemire's essay at the very end made me appreciate this first issue even more. And I'm wondering, had I not read this essay, what my experience in reading this first issue would have been like. But of course, I have no way of knowing.
Right. Well, the first time I read it, I did not have the essay, so I just had the story itself. And reading the essay, for me, it was interesting backstory, but it doesn't really change the actual comic at all for me. For me, again, I had no preconceptions coming into it at all. And so I was going clearly by the story itself. The backstory, I love process. I love knowing how he built this out of two different stories and seeing how it kind of fit into the way he describes his career and stuff like that. It's very interesting. Mm-hmm. But to me, it doesn't really change anything of the way I react to the story itself, because I think the story itself stands on its own very well. Yeah.
And, some of the context here is, we got a review PDF of Gideon Falls #1 when it was first made available from the good folks at Image Comics. And then we had that on hand, but then this was released a couple of weeks ago. And so I was able to get a hold of the actual copy of Gideon Falls #1. So that's the one that I read in preparation for our discussion. Right. And then as I was getting notes around for this week's recording, I was looking at the PDF as I was making notes. And when I got to the very end, I noticed there's no essay. And so that's when I got in touch with you and let you know that, the review PDF that we got is actually incomplete. Now, some people may argue that, and maybe you would, Gene, that the essay really doesn't add much of anything. It's kind of icing on the cake, so to speak. I don't know. Maybe just given the fact that I read it immediately after the story proper in this first issue, I think it did affect the way that I interpreted this first issue. I mean, I really enjoyed the fact that this is not only a story that is made up of a couple of different projects that Lemire has worked on in the past, but especially with the character of Norton Sinclair, that this is a project that Lemire has been mulling over via different medium, right? Not only in comics, for a number of years. And so this is not the second or third time that he's visited this idea. This is something that he's worked and reworked quite a number of times. And to me, that makes this much more of a fascination.
I can see that. But again, for me, the story does well enough on its own. One thing I'd like to mention also is just our cover design, because again, once, the PDF only had the front cover, but now that we've seen the full print issue, we know that we can see the cover for number 2 also. And I really love these covers. It's, because they're both cityscapes. They're kind of one's the cover of number 1 is a cityscape. The cover of number 2 is more of a countryside or farmland, but it's like a helicopter shot. And, it looks like an island, but really it is, the cover of number 1 is Norton as if Norton were a city. It's Norton in profile.
Right. The silhouette of him, yeah.
The silhouette of Norton in profile, yeah. It's a head and shoulder shot. And we know it's Norton because Norton wears a mask. Not a Batman mask, not a domino mask, but like a mask to keep the germs away.
Right.
And, this looks like, and you can clearly see that it's almost Darth Vader-ish sort of, I suppose, to bring Star Wars back in again. But it's really interesting. It's a really interesting drawing because it really does work as if it were like a city on a peninsula or something like that. And then when we see the preview for issue number 2, this is probably our priest. It's a little hard to tell for sure. But, it looks really, they're just really striking covers. And I'm wondering where they're going to go from here because so at this point we've got 2 main characters.
Yeah. And
I'm just curious to see where, again, cause I'm a design moron. I'm curious to see how this design element is going to play through as the series progresses also.
Yeah. Well, and I'm also curious about how this story is going to progress from this point. Because, again, from this 3-page essay at the very end of the first issue, I get the sense from Lemire that this is a story that he and Sorrentino are going to stick with for quite a while. So this is going to be, I guess, relatively speaking, kind of one of those long-haul stories, which is interesting because right now Lemire is in the midst of doing another kind of longer storyline at Image, Royal City, which I think is just fabulous. It was one of my favorites from last year. And so I'm hoping that Gideon Falls is another one of these longer, involved, ongoing narratives, just like Royal City has turned out to be.
Yeah, he does mention it. He does mention in the essay that they've got the whole story planned out, but he's not sure how long it will be. It depends on how well the first issue sells.
Right.
So they've got a story that can compress or expand as needed, I guess, depending on market forces, which is an interesting way to look to think about it. It's like now it's not like we'll have to throw things out. They know what they're going to do. They know the story so well, and they've got different ideas on how to pace it even.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know. To me, it's just a shame that anyone would even think about the possibility of a Jeff Lemire narrative not lasting that long because of sales or a lack of sales. I mean, that would be blasphemy. In my book, Jeff Lemire is right up there with Brian K. Vaughan, an outstanding storyteller. And when he starts something, it's something that should be around for quite a long time.
Yeah, and I hope this is, and I hope, and at this point, since the two of them, the writer and artist, developed it together, I certainly hope that this team stays together on this, because the art is such a integral part of how the story gets told.
Gene, 3 really interesting titles that we looked at for this week. We started off with Bizarre Romance, written by Audrey Niffenegger and with art by Eddie Campbell, her husband. After that, we looked at the first issue of the Ballad of Song, coming out from Oni Press. This was written by Ed Brisson with art by Alessandro Micelli. And then we wrapped up with Jeff Lemire and Andrea Sorrentino's Gideon Falls #1, coming out from Image.
It's a healthy collection of stuff, and again, the two single issues kind of bookend each other pretty well, and they inhabit a very different realm than Bizarre Romance does. So it's a bizarre love triangle.
Yes, and if you, our dear listener, want to find great comics like this at great discounts, then hey, head over to the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and you will not be disappointed at the discounts that you get. You can't beat them. We guarantee it. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about this week's episode. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That is 415-326-6427.
We're also on the emails. If you want to email the show in general, it's two guys, TWO guys, at comicsalternative.com. If you want to yak at me, I'm Gene at comicsalternative.com. And Derek?
I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. You can also find...
Almost like it was planned that way.
Exactly. You can find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. We're all over the damn place. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
Gigabytes of comics talk.
Yeah. And, Gene, lately, I think over the past 2 months especially, we've been getting more and more correspondences through a variety of different medium, right? Not just email, but people contacting us via Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, what have you. And I think this is a good sign. I think it helps to create community when people do contact us and tell us what they think about our show, the good, the bad, maybe the ugly, who knows. And we appreciate that feedback. So definitely do get in touch with us. Continue doing so. We enjoy it. We appreciate it.
Yeah, I noticed that the 3 messages you had today were all from different channels.
Yes. And so that's a good thing. And, you can get in touch with us about anything that we do on the podcast. But we would definitely like to know if there is another comics-related podcast that discusses Bizarre Romance. I don't think that there would be, but if there is, then definitely let us know, and we will eat our words.
That's well, I'm kind of hoping we do, because I think everybody needs to read the book, but we'll find out. If nothing else, we're there first.
That's right. And we will be back first next week with more fun comics talk. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I am Gene.
See you later.
Take care.